This is an ABC podcast.
Rodney Fox is a former spearfishing champion and abalone diver from South Australia. In 1963, Rodney's love of the ocean nearly ended his life when he was attacked by a great white shark. Rodney fought back, gouging the shark's eyes and wrestling the giant creature in a bear hug. Doctors told him it was the worst shark attack they had ever seen, and it took 462 stitches to put his chest back together. But a few months later, Rodney was back in the water, and over time he went from being a hunter of sharks to their defender. Rodney built the first shark cages that enabled divers to safely observe great white sharks in their own domain. And then Hollywood came calling. Rodney worked on the most famous shark movie of all time, Jaws, an experience that involved many strange twists, including putting lipstick on a great white. Hi, Rodney.
Hi, Sarah. It's good to be here.
It's great to have you here. You grew up in Adelaide. Where did you first learn to swim?
Well, when I was about 12 or so, we lived at a market garden, and our neighbours had a great big concrete tank. And any time the temperature was over 90 degrees, my mum would allow me to go swimming in this concrete tank with the neighbour's boy. And we played a lot of games in that tank, like chasing each other and then underwater and swimming around. And the tank, of course, had about 6 inches of mud on the bottom, and it would get really black and dirty, and we were like water rats and got very used to swimming around underwater. Well, actually, the story is my father used to take me fishing, and I used to see a lot of fish that wouldn't get on his line. They were vegetarian fish almost, and so I made myself a hand spear from crab prongs on a broomstick, and the first time I went in the water, I got myself a nice leather jacket, and so my love of the underwater world really started there.
Did you like fish? Did you have a taste for seafood?
In those days, you ate everything that was put in front of you. You never had this like today where they ask you what do you want for tea, dear, for kids. You just ate what was put in front of you. And fish was always a very hard to get thing, and of course I don't know anybody who doesn't really like fish if it's cooked properly, and my parents were really quite keen to catch them either up at the Murray or at the sea, but like even fish today, they were always fairly expensive, so with me spearfishing and bringing home fish, it was certainly a special event.
When you invented your own kind of spear to fish with, how did you get around with it, between your place and the ocean?
Well, in the real early days, I had a push bike. I took a girl to the pictures, and she said, would you like to go out spearfishing? We're thinking of making up a club. And I said yes. So she said, meet us at the railway station, which is like 10 kilometres away from where I lived, at 7 o'clock Sunday morning, and we'll pick you up. And I rode my push bike in there with the spear along the bar, and on my back I had a jumper, a woolen jumper that I used to wear to keep warm because there were no wetsuits in those days. And sure enough, at 7 o'clock they all turned up at the railway station in what was exciting in those days in 1950s, a Land Rover. And we went off to Victor Harbour, which today is like a small town close by, but in those days it was like going to the moon. It was so far away. We went to Victor Harbour, and I was didn't know how good these other guys were, and I hadn't had much experience. And I put on my jumper that I used to keep a bit warmer, and swam out to try and catch a fish and do as good as these other three guys and the one girl there. And I swam and swam and swam, and I couldn't find any reef anywhere. It was all seaweed, seaweed, seaweed. And I came across a net, and there was a salmon, a fairly large salmon, just caught by one fin and kicking around, and looked like it was just going to get out. So I just speared it, and I put it in my jumper. And then I thought, oh, gee, am I stealing it or what am I doing? And so I swam like miles up the other way after half a mile, got out of the water and walked back, and all the other guys were out and they're sitting around the fire shivering, and I threw the fish down. I'd speared another small one on the way, and I never had to tell any lies or do anything because nobody asked me any questions. They just thought I got the biggest fish for the day, and I thought, I never saw the girl again, but the fellas, we all started a club and we've had a fantastic time every Sunday after that for years.
Well, when you don't get the help of a net, Rodney, tell me how you go about spear fishing. What's the process?
So you snorkel along the surface, diving down, swimming along, looking in the weeds and the holes and things, and then you come up for another breath, take a deep breath and go down. And if you can go down for at least 20 seconds, which is pretty easy, most people can do that, you can see a lot of wonderful fish and things underwater. And as you come close to the fish with the rubber gun out in front, you get within spearing distance and you can just spear them and grab hold of them, take them up to the surface. And what we used to do in those days is attach the fish onto a float that you had on some ski rope you were towing behind you, so you just didn't have to hold onto the fish. But, of course, you were trailing a bleeding fish behind you, which we know is not the thing to do if you don't want to attract sharks. But we quickly ventured into we made our own spear guns from wood and rubber and a trigger and a stainless steel spear with a barb on the end of it. And we soon became, there's 3 or 4 of us became really good at catching fish, and it was our lifestyle. We used to play football in the winter and go spearfishing in the summer. And you used to practice holding your breath all the time because the longer you could hold the breath, the longer you'd be underwater.
Did you do that in the ocean or just on land? You'd practice keeping your breath?
Well, one of the worst stories I know is I used to, as a job at the age of 20, I used to drive an explosives truck for Quarry Industries here, and delivering a ton of high explosives to the quarries around Adelaide and in the city, in the country areas. I know it sounds terrible now. I used to hold my breath and count telegraph poles to see how many poles I could count to keep practicing and practicing. And of course, if you hold your breath long enough, you black out. And here I was practicing how long I could hold my breath with a ton of explosives on behind. Is not really the thing that I can recommend to do.
Well, it sounds like thankfully you never blacked out and those explosives got to the quarry safely.
You can call me lucky. We actually became really, really good and slowly got a bit better than most of the other divers around. And we would catch lots and lots of fish and lobsters. To bring a lobster home or a couple of lobsters home, or crayfish as we called them in those days, was really quite exciting because none of our families could ever afford to buy lobster, nor did. So party time was held when we brought home quite a few lobsters. And we used to eat all of our fish. I remember on several occasions coming home Sunday night at about 10 o'clock and dumping about 15, 20 fish on the kitchen table, and Dad would get out of bed and he would clean and fill it, and we would both pack them away, and I felt quite proud to be able to take home. You know, we had a family of 5 children and several feeds of fish for them, and it gave me quite a lot of satisfaction.
You first became South Australian spearfishing champion in 1961. How was that win recorded in the local paper?
That was quite a surprising thing. I felt really good. I had a saying there at that time because competed in 2 or 3 or 4 competitions before, and I kept saying to myself, no one can ever take this away from me. I've done it now. I've felt such a... Because we used to work so hard at being healthy and fit and diving as well. And when the Advertiser newspaper sent a photographer and a guy to do the story on the competition, and I was there with my girlfriend. In those days, bikinis were only just coming in instead of a one-piece uniform. That's what the girls were wearing, and she looked pretty good. And he said, do you mind if Kay holds your fish and puts your mask on? I'll take a photograph of her. And he takes a photograph of... And then he said, do you mind if she puts your lead belt on and holds your spear? So in the newspaper, there's a photograph of my wife in a bikini holding 3 or 4 fish with my gun and my mask and my fish and with the heading, Rodney Fox wins South Australian Championship.
And your family's looking at that photo thinking, see, gee, Rodney looks different in that picture, doesn't he?
It didn't actually. Well, I was quite proud, but actually I had a pretty girlfriend at the time, and I realised afterwards how funny it was. And but having won the competition and having my name and girlfriend there, I think I would have done the same.
You were also an abalone diver. How plentiful were abalone in the seas off the South Australia coast?
Well, as we were collecting lots of fish and lobsters, we went to many, many, many places. Our exploration of the sea was not just to go in the same place. We would go to new places. And, of course, there were stories of shipwrecks and gold, and there was new places. And we knew that at the same time that there could be the giant shark, the megalodon, could still be there. Nobody really knew. And there were these big denizens of the deep, the octopus that could sink boats, and there were all sorts of things that nobody knew much about. So it was a really, really exciting time. It was a bit like the Star Wars movie where you never knew who you were going to find underwater and what you were going to find. And we were down at the southeast once, and we found lots and lots of black-lipped abalone, and we thought, well, these are probably saleable. So 3 of us, we got about 50 to 80 pounds of meat each, and we took it to Raptus, the fish buyer at the time in South Australia. And he said, I don't know. He said, I'm actually heading off to Hong Kong in a week or so. He said, I'll take some over and see if I can get a good sale for them. Well, he got the really good price for them, and he didn't tell us how good a price, but paid us, like I have a receipt home getting 7 pennies, 7 pence per pound for the meat, which now I think they're about $150 a kilogram. So there was a big jump in price slowly over the years. But one of the interesting things was down at the southeast in those days, Sunday, there were no shops open anywhere. Even service stations were hard to find until 9 or 9:30 in the mornings. And most of the service stations were owned by owners. They weren't just run by managers like they are now. And, of course, we never had any money. And we'd go in there and we'd say, we'd like some fuel, but would you like some lobsters? Can we swap some? And we found out what was really interesting is that we would have given them more for the fuel than they took, because we treated them as being like a wholesale price, and they treated them as being the retail price. So we offered them to take whatever they thought was fair, and they would always take less than what we would have given them. And, of course, every service station in the country, big ones anyway, had a cafe, and they always sold mixed grill with a chop and a sausage and a piece of steak and a couple of frozen peas and stuff like that. It was everywhere. And So we swapped some fish and crayfish for those. It was a great day, really. It was quite fun. Yeah.
I'd like to pay for my fuel with lobster. That's a great kind of economy. Of course,
Yeah.
you say, Rodney, there was so much about the oceans that were unknown and dangers with the ocean, of course, as there still are, particularly with spearfishing and rock fishing. When did you first encounter death in the water?
Well, it was a strange incident. Just before we were married, Kay's mother would allow her to go out with me for the Easter weekend down to Victor Harbour, and we were to sleep in a four-bunk caravan, really, and we wanted to go spearfishing all the time. And so we got there, and the weather was foul. It was huge, monstrous swells, and it had been horrible, and we got dressed in our wetsuits, and at that time we had wetsuits, walked down to the beach, and our friend was there with a catamaran, and we were standing looking at the sea thinking, oh, this is no way we're going to go diving. It's so dirty and there's bits of seaweed in the water. And a policeman in a motor car came down. He said, are you guys divers? And we said, no, we hold our breath and dive snorkeling. And he said, do you think you can help us find a body over there? There's a fisherman who's been washed off the rocks. Well, 4 or 5 had been washed off, but one didn't come back. And we're trying to see if we can find his body. So we said, oh, we can try. So the 3 of us hopped onto the catamaran, leaving the girls behind, and we went out to this little island, and we commenced snorkeling up and down in these big swells, and we got in fairly close and saw the 4 or 5 rods, and then a huge wave came over the top, and I dived down. I grabbed hold of a huge rock and let it surge over the top of me, but my mate got carried right up the rocks and got deposited halfway up them and got such a shock he jumped up and ran back down again and swam back out to sea. We swam out a little deeper to try and find a bit more calmer water where we wouldn't get bashed around. And as I dived down in about 40 feet of water, I saw a guy on the bottom looking in a cave, and then I realised that he was wearing sand shoes and a shirt, and he must have been the fisherman we were looking for.
What went through your mind then, Rodney? That's it's what you were looking for, but what a horrible thing to see.
Yeah, and it was one of the problems is I knew that if I went up for a breath of air, the chance that I wouldn't find him, the water was so dirty and it was down in amongst rocks and stuff. So I decided I'd try and help get him up. And as I approached the guy, I had to make a decision of where to grab him. And the funny thing is I didn't really want to get him up by his head, and I grabbed him by the ankle and I was dragging him up to the surface, wondering if I'd ever get there on one breath. And we're heading up to the surface, and then I thought, oh, this is very disrespectful. So I turned him around up the other way, and of course, and I looked at him and I saw that even in those 3 or 4 hours he'd been in the water, the fish had started to eat a little bit of his nose and his ear, and he's bumping and crashing against me, and I'm trying to get to the surface. I got to the surface, and luckily enough, they found me straight away, and a couple of the policemen in a boat and took him and dragged him into their boat and went home. But it's really hard. It was the first time I'd seen a dead body, and it was a little strange knowing what to do. You're not... I don't think you can learn that at school.
Did it make you think twice about the ocean, or did you have much fear about being in the sea back then?
We knew that we could... It's amazing when you have a fair bit of experience with a good pair of fins and a mask, how you can see what's down there, and it takes away your fear. And if you've been looking for things in caves and stuff and being held down for a while, a big surge goes overhead, it's amazing what the human body can actually take and how you can actually adapt to the sea and be really at home. And hold your breath, and if something really goes wrong, you can stay down another 20 seconds, 30 seconds, which doesn't sound much, but it's amazing how much you can do in that time.
When did you first encounter a shark under the waves?
One of the first times was I speared a fish and a big shark came in and ripped it off the end of the spear very fast. It was a bronze whaler shark, and they were fish eaters basically, but anything with the word shark in it in those days was a little bit terrifying because we didn't know much about them. And of course there were sayings in those days, the best shark's a dead shark and we should kill them all, people were saying, and there really are an evil monsters in the sea. And, you know, and so it certainly frightened us a bit. We just packed up and went a couple of miles up the coast to another spot and jumped in the water. So I don't know why it was, but we never really used to think that maybe they would get us, or they were out there. Sharks were actually a bit like devil, death, hell, places that you know are out there, but you're not going to go there immediately.
Well, tell me about the time you did get right up close, much closer than you wanted, to a great white shark while competing in the State Spearfishing Championship in 1963.
Well, this is a year after I won the competitions and I was trying to regain my title. And after 4 hours of spearfishing with about 40 to 50 divers in the water, the area had been swam over, the reefy area, the shallower parts anyway. And I came ashore and unloaded and weighed in a few fish, and I realised I needed a large, they call them a tillywurty or a dusky moorwong. It would help my points tremendously. So I thought, well, I'll go out wider than most people, which means deeper than most people have been, and see if I can find one that haven't been spooked or frightened out there. So I headed well offshore, and about a mile, three-quarters of a mile offshore, and I dived down in 50 to 60 feet of water, holding my breath and swimming along the bottom and coming up the surface and taking a few breaths and then down again. And on one of those dives, I could see the fish I wanted. It had its head in a clump of seaweed, and I knew it couldn't see me, and I just drifted in slowly with the gun out in my right hand in front of me, and I was just about to pull the trigger when this huge thump and crash hit me in the chest, knocked the gun off my hand, the mask off my face. I was hurled through the water faster than I could even swim, and I knew I was in really big trouble. And a funny thing happened. It sort of, I thought of a train. That's how big and heavy it was. And I don't know why I thought of a train. I'd never actually ever been on a train.
Could you see that it was a shark? I mean, as soon as you're taken by surprise, but then straight away are you aware of that the animal's right there next to you?
Well, it's got me around the chest and swimming through the water, and then I realised that it had to be a giant shark. A friend of mine, 18 months earlier, Brian Roger, had been bitten by a shark on the leg. And we had had lots of talks about what the most vulnerable spot is on a shark if you had to defend yourself. And the eyes, and I knew straight away I had to gouge its eyes. So I gouged around its head with my hands, with the chest, with my left arm was over the top of it, and I gouged. And I don't even know what happened, but the shark seemed to stop and let me go. And I instinctively, with my right hand, pushed at its head to push it away, and my hand disappeared into its mouth over its shiny white teeth. I remember them, and cut. Really, I could feel the cuts as if you cut yourself with a razor blade. And I drew my arm out quickly before it could chop it off. And then I grabbed it in a bear hug, and I grabbed it back from its jaws and held on. And then I realised I was like 50 feet of underwater holding my breath and I'm going to drown, much less die of my wounds. I let go and pushed off and headed up to the surface. And just before I got to the surface, I could see even through without a mask on, you can see reasonably well in the water, well, blurry. And I could see it was bright red, and I knew it was my blood. And then in front of me, as I was looking up to the surface to see how far I had to go, this great big shark came towards me with great white teeth, and of course through this red haze. And I thought, I'm gone. I've got nothing to protect myself. And I kicked as hard as I could with my right foot at it, as hard as I could. But everything underwater is about 30% further away than you think it is. And my fin just touched it. But a miracle happened. The shark went for the float that I had a couple of fish on and swallowed the float and the fish. And then the line went tight and it dragged me through the water. The shark dived and I was pulled downwards. Now, I knew I had to get rid of my lead weights, which had the cord tied to them. And I put my left hand down because my brain knew that my right hand was actually, it only had one finger that had with tendons left in it. All the other four were cut. And I tried to find the quick release catch, but all I found was lead weights. Apparently the belt had slid around, and I was just about to dive, gasp water in. I just had enough. I couldn't hold my breath any longer. And the line snapped. Apparently, as the shark was dragging me through the water, it snapped because when it had bitten me around the chest, it had severed the line halfway through.
Podcast. Broadcast. This is Conversations with Sarah Konoski. Hear more conversations anytime on the ABC Listen app. Or go to abc.net.au/conversations.
Rodney, what happened after you managed to get free from the shark, but were still underwater and terribly injured?
I didn't know which way was up, first of all, and I remember like a leaf drifts down from a tree, drifting up towards the surface, and then I managed to get there and yell out, "Shark, shark!" And another miracle, a couple of guys in a very small boat had seen this bright red water and were coming over to have a look to see what was going on. And I came up in the middle of it, and they quickly rolled me into the boat, onto shore, into a station wagon, halfway to the city. Two ladies picked me up in an ambulance, and they raced me into hospital and then on the operation to be stitched up.
Oh, Rodney, what a story. Were you in incredible pain under the water, given what a huge bite that great white had given around your chest?
The fear of dying, I've analysed this a fair bit since then, and the fear of dying overrides the pain of bodily pain at the time. And it was only when I was actually in the boat, in the hands of other people, and I knew I couldn't do anything for myself, I was just laying there, that the waves of pain started to come in and take over. And of course they were pretty excruciating. And with a cut lung, it was really hard to breathe, collapsed lung, and if I sucked in air, it would gurgle down, on my chest where the wound was open. Funny thing happened, and there's always some lovely things. About 30 years later, a guy came up to me in our shark museum, which we were running at the time, and he said, "You don't know me, but I was the guy, or the orderly, who opened the ambulance door when you were brought in for your shark attack. Do you know what you said?" And I knew I'd had a terrible time coming in the ambulance just to stay alive and to breathe and to get rocked around, of course. You can imagine that the wound being crunched together and the bones and things as the movement of the ambulance raced through the rough roads. I said, "No, I didn't know I said anything." He said, "You said, 'Thank Christ that's over. The ride was worse than the shark attack.'" So I don't know whether I would have sworn at the time, although I may have, because I usually didn't do any swearing. But,
These were extreme circumstances, Rodney.
so it was funny. And there on the operating table, of course, they cut everything off me and started stitching me up. And
what did they do? How many stitches?
Well, in my hand there was 93. One doctor was stitching up my hand and my tendons and stuff, and they thought they may have to cut off the little finger, but they decided to have a try and stitch it together. And over 400, and I think the doctor said 462 stitches they put in they had to stitch up the lung and the pleural sac and all the ribs and the muscles, and then he said, like any good plumber, he said, we pulled over the skin and covered in the hole.
What kind of scar did that leave you with?
Well, it left me with a chest scar that I had no idea how many times I'd have to take off my shirt and show people over the years. And the pictures they took, after they took my wetsuit off, and then later, after they'd stitched me up, put all the stitches in there, those two pictures actually were published all the way around the world, and it's amazing how many people have seen them, and for National Geographic and Reader's Digest and magazine articles and stuff, and it's amazing how many free dinners I've had since then because of those scars.
Is it something you would have nightmares about, particularly in the early weeks and months after that attack?
That was a really strong and hard and difficult thing, and I'm really proud that I was managed and always was able to suppress the nightmares. Many of occasions I would go back, and even in sleep, I would start to have a nightmare about how it happened and what happened, and I was able to wake myself up even in the middle of sleep and to think of other things and to get rid of it out of my brain. And even in hospital, it was when I was 22 at the time, I had to wake up, and I didn't sleep for days and days and days, although it's probably a lot of the drugs that I was on at the time. But I had to think of other things to get rid of it. I first of all started thinking about sheep jumping, because that's a well-known thing that you think about, jumping sheep, and maybe get back to sleep without having a nightmare. And that didn't work very well. And then I thought about beautiful flowers and fields of flowers and pretty things like that, and that didn't seem to help. And then I thought of steaks and lobsters and beautiful food, and that seemed to help a little bit. But what really took my mind off of it was girls' boobs, or my wife's boobs at the time, and that helped tremendously. It really did.
I'm glad you found your way to that solution, Rodney. How long did it take you to get back in the water?
Well, the first experience was really interesting. My scars were still bad and I was still a bit weak. But the first Sunday outing that many of the clubs had was down close to Aldinga at Horseshoe Reef. And there was a lot of the club members went down there on a beautiful sunny day. And I had actually had a 15, 16-foot ski that we used to go spearfishing on and lay on. And my wife actually paddled me out into the middle of about 12 or 15 divers' heads that were spearfishing off this reef. And I decided I'd go in the middle of them and go into the water. And I was so weak, she had to load my gun, pull the rubber back on the gun. And I got into the water, and immediately I saw sharks everywhere. And they were actually the sun gleaming rippling on the surface, sending shiny bits of shiny waves towards me. And I said to myself, gee, Rodney, you're going to have to get rid of them or you'll never be any good. And realising that they weren't, of course, sharks, but they were just flashes of light. And there, straight underneath me, was a prize fish sitting in a hole. I dived down, my chest ached. It was a bit far down, but I pulled the trigger, and being a good shot, I shot it. and I managed to pull it up and climb onto the boat, and my wife paddled me back to shore where my family and a lot of friends were, and I had this prize fish, and which we had for tea with my wife, my brothers and sisters, and Mum cooked it for tea, and we all sat down and had a great time. And so it helped to, it was such a reward, feeling good that you're providing for your family and stuff. And it took quite a few months, of course, to get back. It took a year to really get back healthy again. But I cannot believe now at the age of 81 that I haven't really had any problems from the shark attack in all those years. I've got this huge scar. All the ribs are a little bit mismatched and don't join very much. And the funny thing is, the only thing that I can really say happened is if I had had a few drinks and I was at a party, I used to get a little bit of cramp in my shark attack wound, and I'd rub it and it would go away. It was no pain really, anything, and it would remind me just how lucky I was. It was good, yeah.
I thought you were going to say when you were at a party and had a bit to drink, you'd take your shirt off and show that scar as well.
Yeah. That became so regular. I was walking up the street in Adelaide one day back before I went abalone diving when I was a life insurance salesman, and I was walking along the street and a girl come over and said something to me. I had 3 buttons undone before I realised she'd actually asked me the time.
How did you feel about sharks in the weeks and months after that terrible injury, Rodney?
The biggest anomaly was in hospital. I could not believe how people had showed this incredible fear and hatred towards sharks. It was the fear, really, I know now, of the unknown. They just thought that, most people thought that if a shark saw a human in the water, would just come in and bite it, and that they were just killers, and that they, the best shark's a dead shark and stuff like that. There was such an overreaction that I just felt it was wrong. And I was a bit disappointed that I'd frightened so many people out of the water with the publicity that was given with my shark attack. And for years and years and years, I had to fight that anomaly of how bad sharks, and even today, I think if there's somebody is hurt badly or killed by a shark, it's in the newspapers for 3 or 4 days, whereas if somebody dies in a car accident, you're lucky to even make the first page anymore. It might make the 3rd page or so. And I started defending them and saying, well, they're not that bad, and we've got to learn to live with them and not kill them from fear, was my statement at the time.
What idea did you get on a trip to the zoo not long after that shark attack?
I was at the Adelaide Zoo with my wife, and we were wandering around with our little niece, a 4-year-old niece, and we were out the front of the lion's cage, big male lion in the cage, and it sort of said, well, he's a man-eater too, and I associated them with the big great white sharks, and he's a man-eater too, and that's why they got him in the bars there. And I thought, well, maybe I can reverse the role. Maybe I can build a cage, put it down out with great white sharks, and I'll have a look and make up my own mind as if I want to continue diving again.
Did you build the cage yourself?
I designed it, and we made it out of weld mesh, which is a fairly strong steel that they put in concrete, and as a 2-man cage. And I organised an expedition, and we were really fortunate to find a tuna boat that had just been finished, and they hadn't done a trial run and before the tuna season, and I managed to get it for just the cost of the fuel, and they'd go for a 10-day trip, and we would try and make a film, because I knew Ron Taylor at that time, and he and I were going to go partners in the first ever film of great white sharks and diving. And we called into a place called Memory Cove, and Alf put out some whale oil, which you could get at that time because whales were being slaughtered in Albany, and you could just buy tins of oil, and dripped it into the water. And he showed me that just a little trail of oil in the water going out with the tide, it's amazing how the sharks can sense it and follow it back to its source, which is the boat. And about midnight, a big shark rattled and came and bashed around the back of the boat, and we got up, and so we put some fish over the side to try and hope that it would stay there till morning. And then the next morning, I put the cage over the side and jumped in the water.
And what happened once you were in the cage?
Oh, when it was in the cage, the water was a bit dirty, but you could see right towards the back of on the side of the boat I was in the cage. And I was looking around and looking at the baits they had out the back where I thought the shark would come from. And then all of a sudden, right in front of me was a submarine with eyes. And the eyes are just looking at me, these big black eyes. But it didn't take any notice of me in the cage. It was looking at the fish and the bait we had hanging over the bat, and it went straight towards it and grabbed it and shook its head. Alf actually had a hook inside of it and managed to hook that one. But the shark didn't take any notice of me at all. It just went straight past.
Did you feel protected in that cage he'd created?
I didn't feel too bad at all, except I did find out that I didn't have to tell myself to let go of the bars and stand back, because first thing I remembered is my back's on the back of the cage anyway, so I must have backed away naturally. And then I realised just how safe I felt, and all the other guys got in the cage and had a look, and we've made a film, and we were the first ones ever to film great whites underwater. And amazingly enough, that started a lifetime of organising expeditions, and which I never really had to advertise at all. People just kept coming to me and asking me if I would organise trips. And being an abalone diver, I was able to mix it in with my work as well. So I could just leave abalone diving and go off and organise expeditions.
Because of these expeditions and the underwater filming you were involved in, you earned a bit of a reputation as the go-to shark man for filmmakers. How did you get involved in the most famous shark movie of all time, Rodney?
Jaws, eh? I got a phone call from Hollywood asking me if I'd be involved and organise a trip for... It was a fairly long one. I think it was for 6 weeks. They were going to send out a film crew, and they were making this big shark movie for a major film company, and would I organise the expedition and supply a couple of boats and my diving expertise and put them up and show them where to live and how to live and what to do. And we organised that, but they sent out a midget diver, a half-sized man, a little guy who was a stunt rider for kids off horses. And Carl Rizzo is his name. And apparently his agent had told him that all you've got to do, here's a good job for you, they're going to pay you all this money, all you have to do is stand inside a very strong steel cage and the shark's going to swim around you, and that's all you've got to do. But he couldn't even dive. We didn't...
Why did they send a midget? Why did they send a little person for this filming?
Well, that was the whole thing. They sent a half-size cage, a half-size man, a half-size scuba tanks, half-size weights, half-size fins, everything half-size, to make sure that our 12 to 14-foot sharks looked like they were 25 feet long.
What, so the scale? They wanted to have everything smaller to make the shark look bigger.
The scale was the thing. And even the underside of my abalone boat at the time, which was a 20-foot Bertram, was to be the undersize of the 40-foot orca in the film. So everything was half size, and from underneath all you'd see was a shadow.
How did this poor guy who was told by his agent, here's an easy way to make some money, how did he cope in the cage with the white sharks?
Well, he was a bit frightened, And at one stage there, when the first time we had him, we had some sharks swimming around, and we decided to put the small cage, which was actually twice as heavy as my camera cage, because the people at Universal Studios had only read the book Jaws and had no idea, so they made it out of solid steel instead of pipe. And it was so heavy, when we hung it over the side of my 20-foot boat on the bit of a winch, it pushed the boat hung up right over sideways because it was so heavy. At one stage, we had one shark swimming around, and the first time ever we put him in the water, we opened the doors at the top and put him in and lowered the cage down to only about a metre under the water. And Ron Taylor jumped in the cage on the other boat and was filming upwards at the cage in my boat. And because it was so heavy, I was busy pushing all the lead weights and fuel drums and stuff over the other side to try and make it level, the boat, so it would sit in the water level. And we heard a yell come from the other boat, from the mothership, saying, "Quick, pull up, Carl, he's drowning, he's drowning." So I wound the winch up, but it was so heavy it wouldn't come out of the water. There was no test runs or anything. This is the first time. So I opened the lid and touched him on the head, expecting him to come piling out of the cage. And he didn't. So I touched him on the head again and he didn't come. And I realised he must be in some trouble. So I put both arms down, hanging over the side of my boat, the gunnel, under his, and I lifted. But in his panic, he's holding onto the cage. So I'm lifting this huge, heavy cage and him as well. So I hit him on one of the hands, and he thought he must have been bitten by the shark, so he let go and leapt, and he come piling up out of the cage, and with this little scuba tank, all with a wetsuit slippery on it, and was kicking and screaming and lobbed on my chest in the bottom of my boat, and we were kicking around like wounded seals there for a long time. And I'm saying to him, "What's the matter? What's the matter?" And he said, my mask, it's filling up with water." And nobody had taught him that when a little bit of water runs up through your nose there, that you can just blow it out by holding the top of your mask and snorting, and it just comes out. So we spent the next couple of days trying to get him to learn how to use a mask and clear his mask.
Poor Carl, he's probably moved to the top of a high mountain or a desert or somewhere as far away from the ocean as he could possibly get after all of this.
Yeah, I think he's gone back to horses. They're safer.
You had to get creative with some bullet holes on the shark. Tell me about that.
Well, they sent out this wonderful booklet of pictures exactly that they wanted, like a comic book of drawings and showing exactly what they wanted. And they're quite strange, because one of them said they wanted the shark to do clockwise circles around the cage and try and get the sun over the left-hand side in the corner with those little globules of sunlight glistening down. And anybody who's worked with sharks in the rough sea with the tides going one way and everything going the other, and the shark doesn't know his left hand from his right hand, we had difficulty getting things done. But one of the scenes was where they wanted 3 bullet holes on a shark, and they sent over this tin of red paint, a sponge with a broomstick, and said instructions: screw the sponge on the end of the broomstick, plunge it into the paint, and as the shark swims past, put it in this exact sequence in these 3 spots on it. Well, I don't know about Americans, but Australians know that paint and shark and water don't go very well together. Anyway, we came up with the idea that we'd use Valerie Taylor's lipstick. And somehow I got the job of drawing bullet holes on the top of the shark. And
how?
We put a tuna over the back of the boat, and as the shark came up to take and bite on the tuna, they pulled it up really high, and I was to lean over the side of the boat and, as it's snapping away, draw bullet holes onto the side of the boat.
With Valerie Taylor's lipstick? Just with your hand, or was it on a stick or something? Were you just reaching over to the shark's head?
I was hanging over the shark's head, but hanging, there was no sort of health and safety in those days. I think one of the guys, Ron Taylor, I probably had his hand inside my pants holding onto my belt, was the only safety I had. And the shark came up and I managed to get one good bullet hole, and I went back and it swam around the cage, it swam around the boat and disappeared for a while. Then it came back and had another one. So we ended up hanging over the side like this, and it was really something I wouldn't do now.
Glad to hear it.
And I wouldn't let any of my family do it. And we managed to get 3 holes drawn on the shark, and Ron Taylor got in the cage, and the director said, that's it, we had to have 3, and the shark swam around the front of the boat, and we stood there waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting, and we never saw the shark again.
After all that, you didn't even get to film those bullet holes.
They didn't even take a snapshot of us doing it, and it was like a day's work and nothing happened, yeah.
How did you feel when you finally saw that movie on the big screen?
I was a bit. Well, I didn't tell anybody I worked on. I was a bit ashamed because it frightened so many people out of the water. And that was positively not what I wanted it to do. And it portrayed the shark with so many lies that gave them powers that they never had and were bigger. It was such a thing that I was just a bit disappointed that I'd even had anything. I didn't tell anybody for years about how it did. And, on our expeditions now, we run expeditions continually with people from all the way around the world, and we've made over 80 different films and documentaries, and most of them now are, of course, is to try and help sharks, is try and get them to people to understand them better and show what goes on. But so many people and marine scientists and people who have done their PhDs and stuff on sharks have said it was actually the Jaws movie that stimulated them to take interest in sharks. And so it didn't do all bad. It's done quite a bit of good as well. So
You're 81 now. Do you spend much time in the ocean?
No, Adelaide is fairly cold, and to enjoy yourself in the ocean here, you really have to wear a fairly big wetsuit, and it's so hard to put it on and all that weight. I snorkel quite a bit we have a beach shack and I snorkel there, but if I could get up into the tropics and go on the Great Barrier Reef, I would be loved to dive, do lots more diving. When I go on holidays, I still snorkel and dive, and I'm going out again in January on an expedition with my son, who now runs our great white shark expeditions, and I told him I'll go in if I want to, not if I have to.
I hope you have many, many more great dives, but safe dives ahead of you. Rodney, thank you so much for telling your story on Conversations.
Yes, well, that's the time's passed fairly quickly, and I've had a fabulous life, really, and travelled all over the world giving lectures and talks, and just getting people to try and understand sharks a bit better.
That was my conversation with Rodney Fox from last year. I'm Sarah Konoski. Thanks so much for listening.
You've been listening to a podcast of Conversations with Sarah Konoski. For more Conversations interviews, head to the website abc.net.au/conversations.
Discover more great ABC podcasts, live radio and exclusives on the ABC Listen app.